Okay, let's see if I can figure this out. All right, so my research is qualitative, phenomenological, hermeneutic, a lot of big words. Just meaning that I used a lot of interviews, a lot of just qualitative research. And I cannot advance my slides. What in the world? Good grief. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know why it's not advancing. Try this again. I'm using up my minutes. Okay, so we'll just stay in this view and hopefully that'll work. Okay, so here's my background, research literature summarized. Researchers have identified 5 areas of the self that can be impacted by traumatic events, including memory and perception, frame of reference, ego resources, self-capacity, and central psychological needs. And so they use this through the creation of the constructivist self-development theory, which asserts that individuals organize experiences by implementing the traumatic events into a unique constellation of the 5 areas of self through their lens of already existing beliefs about others and about their world. So the 5 primary psychological needs of safety, trust, intimacy, control needs, and esteem can be significantly impacted by experiencing trauma in a primary or a vicarious role, and can create the symptoms of vicarious trauma. Perlman and Courtois implemented the constructivist self-development theory and identified 3 self-capacities that include affect tolerance, self-worth, and an interconnection to compassionate others. And they considered how early attachment experiences can enhance or impede self-capacities, and how this information can help treat clinically challenging clients with trauma histories. So the research literature summarized, there was no literature that I could find that explored male counselors' experiences of child victims of trauma. And so this is why I use the qualitative lens, because there was nothing to compare it to. And so the literature did define trauma as serious injury to the body as a form of physical violence or an accident, an experience that causes severe anxiety or emotional distress, such as rape or combat. And other definitions include introduction into the body of a toxic substance, psychic injury resulting from a severe emotional shock, and it can occur in the body or the mind. Vicarious trauma, they diagnosed, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual identified indirect trauma as traumatic material that was not experienced or witnessed firsthand, but as being exposed to the trauma material through another. Male counselors, men are different than women. We know this, and this is no different within female and male counselors. It's generally acknowledged that men are socialized differently than women and face different privileges and struggles than women. The literature demonstrated that boys are socialized to be independent, competitive, and self-confident and work toward achievement while suppressing emotion. And girls are socialized to be obedient, responsible, and nurturing, and to focus on interpersonal relationships to be more accommodating, compliant, and self-conscious. And they also tend to have lower self-esteem. The literature on counseling children, obviously, children have demonstrated that they have a unique challenge for counselors. They are not present with adults. So one of the ways to improve treating children is to acknowledge these differences, including limited vocabulary, limited coping skills, differing cognitive abilities, different emotional development, and the challenges in working with the needs of their guardian and parents. So children communicate through actions and play, so counselors must implement behavioral tracking. The gap in the literature, men are increasingly a minority in professions such as counseling and psychology, and many male counselors describe feeling unheard and socially isolated in the field. These impressions of isolation and underrepresentation include the fields of research, as males' absence of voice and escalating marginalization within counseling education and research establishes a gap in how to train and educate male counseling students and clinicians who are at risk of suffering the detrimental effects of listening to clients' trauma. The need for the study is to create and apply instruction to improve the quality of life of these male counselors. So the social impact would be to inform educators of male counseling students concerning how they could experience their clients' trauma material, and can also highlight the importance of building resiliency and implementing self-care with these men. The research statement. So the primary question is, what is the lived experience of male counselors who primarily work with children who have experienced trauma? So I'm sorry, I can't multitask apparently. So my initial 4 questions established education, training, and experiential history of participants working with children who have experienced trauma. The next 3 interview questions addressed help-seeking behaviors of supervision and consultation and participants' experiences with these. The next interview questions asked about potential changes in identity, worldview, or belief systems since working with children who have experienced trauma. Next, I ask a series of questions asking participants to describe if and how counseling children with trauma has affected them emotionally, their thinking, spiritually, behaviorally, in personal relationships, sleep, and work performance. Next, I ask if participants have sought any type of counseling or consultation as a result of counseling children, and if so, what were their experiences? And finally, I offer participants the opportunity to share any additional experiences or information they may like to discuss. So, theoretical conceptual framework. The primary theory I use is phenomenology, created by Heidegger, which allowed me to hear and interpret firsthand experiences of participants using semi-structured and open-ended interviews to illustrate participants' first-person perspective and experiences. Phenomenological research aims to explain, explore, and describe the phenomenon being studied, using an interpretive position to explore in what manner participants experience, interpret, and create meaning in their worlds. I added the constructivist self-development theory, as this theory was created to overcome weaknesses of previous theories and was called a clinical trauma theory and an integrative personality theory by its creators, who also stated that this theory provides a template for identifying both damage and growth after trauma. So the method, I use qualitative research to gain an understanding of underlying reasons, opinions, and motivations. This method provides insight into problems or helps to identify and develop ideas for hypothesis and potential quantitative research in the future. It gathers raw data in the form of interview answers as opposed to numerical responses that can be quantified. Participants and sample size. Participants were licensed American male counselors in their state of practice. They all verified that they were currently counseling children who have experienced trauma. The sample size included 6 participants to increase the confidentiality of my findings and the confidence, trustworthiness, validity, stability, and precision by following a replicable strategy. The number of participants allowed me to reach saturation and gain in-depth understanding through rich description that includes qualitative data from participants. I conducted 60-minute face-to-face semi-structured audio recorded interviews as a method of exploratory research in order to get descriptive rich data. My data analysis used interpretive phenomenological analysis to implement Heidegger's philosophy while applying it to data analysis. An interpretive phenomenological analysis requires the research to collect detailed, reflective first-person accounts and then focus those accounts to give voice and make sense, make meaning. And so I also use the constructivist self-development theory as a lens to analyze and interpret. So my findings, rigorous data resulted in development of 13 themes, including an eclectic theoretical approach. Majority of clients have experienced trauma, increased empathy and growth, negative impact of vicarious trauma, help-seeking behaviors, denial of help-seeking behaviors, interestingly. They sought additional training, use of coping skills, supportive supervisors, peer consultation, supervisor role, the world is unsafe and people are bad, and a need for increased knowledge when working with these clients, which these findings match the definition that Figley gave of vicarious trauma as cumulative, predictable, treatable, and preventable unwanted consequence of working with suffering people. So the participants gave examples of each of the 7 areas of life previously identified and supported of the existing scholarly research. So the limitations, the design of the study was the primary limitation of my study. Because I conducted the research, I also had to interpret the data. So this is a limitation. I mitigated potential bias using the constructivist self-development theory. To mitigate potential bias, I also implemented triangulation through member checking. In addition, in using phenomenological interviewing, a limitation could be the assumption that the self-reported stories and experiences of participants were truthful and accurately portrayed their actual experiences. To diminish this potential limitation, I implemented a semi-structured interview approach, used clarification, reframing, and open-ended questions with the goal of eliciting comprehensive details and information. Additionally, although I made attempts to seek participants from a diverse population, all of my participants were white, and based on this limitation, the study will not be transferable to any other race. Fortunately, the age range of participants was from mid-20s to late 60s, which improved the diversity within the age of participants in my study. And finally, social change implications. The study appears to be the first, focusing on this construct, and will inherently lead to ways for future studies. It is my hope that it will create recognition of potential future studies. And I also hope that the findings will be a positive impetus for change that will begin to empower current and future male students and counselors to effectively understand and mitigate negative consequences of vicarious trauma from working with children who have experienced trauma. As a recommendation for action and social change, results of the study indicated that male counselors may not be receiving adequate education and training to empower them to effectively work with children who experience trauma. And so counselor educators should consider focusing targeted learning to provide education and experience that will present male counseling students with realistic expectations and applicable interventions to help them conceptualize what working with children who experience trauma might look like, sound like, and feel like. And I think I may have went over, so I apologize. And anyone have any questions?
So I have a question, Dr. Wallace. Okay, so very interesting. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Very interesting. And we're also, two of our presenters are not yet signed in, so we have a little extra time, so we can go a little longer. But I was really curious about, okay, you talked about hermeneutic phenomenology, right? So if you could speak for a moment, just to, maybe clarify, because I'm not completely clear about the methodology related to hermeneutic phenomenology and how it related to your study. I'd be really curious about that.
So the hermeneutic just supported the primary goal of the qualitative, the phenomenological approach in trying to gather what the lived experience was. It really just helped me to have a lens from which to ask the questions, to really gather the information that I felt was lacking in, obviously in the gap in the literature, there is none. And so trying to say, okay, I need an approach, which hermeneutic really seemed the approach that would allow me kind of the open-ended, semi-structured approach. I didn't want closed questioning where the clients or the participants felt like they could only answer in 1 or 2 sentences. I wanted really that rich depth descriptive information that hermeneutic could give me. And then I also thought that although that would really have been what most people kind of stopped, where they just did the research and found the themes, I felt like the need to kind of interpret a little bit more deeply what those themes were, since I was trying to gather how to best help future counseling students. And in my experience as a counselor, I have counselors as clients. And so just saying, how can we help identify what these gaps are, and how can we help these men who are now counselors and experiencing vicarious trauma to not only identify, recognize the symptoms, normalize vicarious trauma, and then be able to implement the self-care that they never really were socialized to use or to even